My name is Emily, and until last year I believed my family was unshakable. My parents had been together for over 25 years, and I grew up watching them share a quiet, deep kind of love, the kind that doesn't need grand gestures or constant words. My mom, Sarah, was the heart of our home. She had this calming presence that made even the worst days bearable. I still remember her humming while cooking dinner, her gentle touch when I was sick, and the way she would always wait up for me when I stayed out late. My dad, Mark, was the quiet backbone of our family. He worked hard, always put us first, and though his words were few, his actions spoke volumes. Together they were the perfect balance. My safe place. Everything changed the day Mom was diagnosed with cancer. It was one of those words you think only happens to other people until it shatters your world. The news was like a sharp blade cutting through the normalcy we had always known. My strong, vibrant mother was suddenly frail and tired. Hospital visits replaced family dinners, medications replaced her favorite recipes, and the sound of her laughter slowly faded. I watched her lose pieces of herself every day, and though she never once complained, her body couldn't hide the truth. Dad did everything humanly possible. Research, second opinions, holding her hand through treatments. He didn't cry, at least not where I could see, but I could feel the weight pulling at him. The last conversation I had with my mom is something I replay in my head more than I'd like to admit. She was lying in bed, her voice soft but steady. She told me that love was about letting go, about trusting the people you care for to find happiness, even when you're not around to see it. At the time I thought she was talking about me, about growing up and living a full life without her. I didn't realize those words were for both me and Dad. When she passed away, the silence in our house was unbearable. Every corner of every room held a memory of her. I avoided coming home as much as I could, staying late at school or at friends' houses, and Dad threw himself into work. We lived under the same roof, but it felt like we were strangers sharing the same loss, locked away in our own separate cages of grief. We didn't know how to talk about her, or about anything really. We just existed. I never thought life could feel so empty, or that I could miss someone so deeply it hurt to breathe. But that was our new reality, and neither of us had the strength to change it. Weeks slipped by, but the heaviness in the house never lifted. I could see the change in my dad more than anyone else. His routine was the same, but something about him felt off, like he was going through the motions instead of living. He started spending more time in the backyard, sitting alone, staring at nothing, and leaving half his dinner untouched. One evening, when I least expected it, he broke the silence. His voice was shaky, something I wasn't used to hearing from him. He asked me a question I never imagined would come from his mouth. He said, "How would you feel if I started seeing someone?" I sat there, frozen, trying to figure out if I had misheard him. The words felt like they didn't belong in the air. Not so soon. Not while her scent still lingered in the house. Not while I still heard her voice in my head every night. I didn't know how to answer him, and I didn't even try. My mind raced through confusion, sadness, and something that felt like betrayal. I couldn't understand how he could even think about anyone else when the space Mom left behind was still so painfully empty. But before I could say anything, he kept talking. He explained how lonely the nights had become, how every meal tasted like cardboard, and how waking up in the morning felt like opening his eyes to the same nightmare. He told me he had loved Mom with everything he had, but her last words to him were clear. She didn't want him to spend the rest of his life alone. I wanted to argue, to tell him it was too soon, that it was wrong, that moving on wasn't an option. But deep down I could hear her voice too. I remembered her strength, her selflessness, and the way she always put others before herself. I knew she wouldn't have wanted him to be miserable, but knowing that didn't make the reality any easier to accept. My dad wasn't asking for my permission, not really. He was asking for my understanding, for a small piece of approval to ease his own guilt. The weight of the question hung in the room long after he stopped talking, and I couldn't offer him anything in return. I stood up, walked away, and left him sitting there, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. My heart was torn between holding on to the past and making space for whatever future he was hoping for. I didn't have an answer for him that night, and honestly, I wasn't sure I ever would. I spent the next few days lost in my own thoughts, replaying his words over and over. Part of me felt selfish for not answering him, and the other part felt justified for needing more time. I ended up talking to my mom's closest friend, someone who had known both my parents since before I was born. I expected her to be just as shocked as I was, but instead, she listened calmly and then said something that stuck with me. She told me love doesn't disappear when someone dies, it just changes form, and the people left behind have to decide whether to stay trapped in grief or allow themselves to live again. She reminded me that my mom was the kind of person who believed in life moving forward, not standing still in sorrow. I kept thinking about that conversation, and slowly I started to see things differently. My dad wasn't trying to replace my mom. Nobody could. He was simply looking for a way to fill the unbearable silence that had taken over his life. I remembered the nights when I could hear him pacing the hallway, the mornings when he sat at the kitchen table staring at his coffee, lost in thought. He wasn't asking to forget her. He was asking to survive without her. The day I finally gathered the courage to talk to him again, I realized he had been waiting for me to bring it up. When I asked him if he had already met someone, he nodded. He said it wasn't serious, just conversations over coffee, but it had given him something he hadn't felt since Mom passed, the ability to smile without feeling guilty. I could hear how hard it was for him to admit it, as if even speaking the words felt like a betrayal. But I also saw the relief in his eyes when I told him I understood. I didn't lie and say it didn't hurt, but I told him I knew he deserved to be happy again. We both sat there not saying much after that, but the silence felt different this time. It wasn't heavy or filled with unspoken pain. It was quiet but peaceful. It took me a while to fully accept the idea, but understanding his loneliness helped me let go of the anger I didn't even know I was carrying. I began to see him not just as my dad, but as a man who had lost the love of his life and was trying, in the only way he knew how, to rebuild the pieces of himself. I realized that love wasn't about holding on so tightly you suffocate. It was about allowing space for healing, even if it meant welcoming something unfamiliar. When I finally met the woman my dad had been talking to, I didn't know what to expect. I had built so many assumptions in my head, but none of them prepared me for how simple and genuine she turned out to be. Her name was Linda, and from the start, she never tried to pretend or replace anyone. She spoke softly, listened more than she talked, and made it clear she understood the space my mom had left in both our lives. She shared her own story about losing her husband years ago, and for the first time I realized she wasn't stepping into our lives as a stranger trying to fill a gap, but as someone who knew loss all too well. That quiet understanding was what softened me. It wasn't about forgetting my mom. It was about learning to live with the grief without letting it control every part of us. Slowly, life started to feel a little less cold. My dad smiled more, the house felt less empty, and I noticed we weren't avoiding conversations about Mom anymore. In fact, Linda encouraged them. She respected the memories we held onto, and she never asked me to move on or pretend the past didn't exist. She simply became part of the present without trying to erase what came before. It taught me something I hadn't understood until then. Grief and new beginnings can exist side by side. As time passed, I started to see my dad becoming himself again. Not the same, of course, but stronger, more open, and more present. I watched him build something new without breaking what was left of the past. I realized my mom's last gift to him wasn't her goodbye, but the freedom to find joy again, even if it looked different from the life they shared. One afternoon, I visited her grave and found myself telling her everything. About Dad, about Linda, about how I'd finally understood what she meant that day in her hospital bed. Letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about making space for love to grow in a new direction. That visit gave me peace I hadn't known I needed. Walking away from her grave, I didn't feel like I was leaving her behind. I felt like I was carrying her forward, just in a different way. My dad's happiness didn't mean he loved her any less, and my acceptance didn't mean I had stopped missing her. Life hadn't gone back to the way it was, but it had found a way to keep moving, and somehow that was enough. I finally understood that love doesn't die, it just changes, and if you let it, it can still fill the empty spaces with something just as real, just as strong.